In 1899, the Presbyterian Church sent a promising new minister to its flagship mission in Fort Wrangel, Alaska. This was a church with a long legacy, for it was the first Protestant church in Alaska. When the Reverend H.P. Corser arrived in Fort Wrangel, he saw a congregation and community split along racial lines. He began speaking out, challenging the community, and eventually challenging his superiors in the Presbyterian Church. The conflict would get worse until it would lead to a walkout, culminating in the founding of H.P. Corser's most lasting contribution, St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Today's episode is Reverend Corser's Rebellion. Chapter 1. Genesis. Harry Prosper Corser went by H.P. his whole life. H.P. was born on April 13, 1864, in the rural hamlet of Portageville, New York. He was raised in Towanda, Pennsylvania. H.P. was the first of 3 sons born to John Farmer Corser and his wife, Harriet. H.P. got his middle name, Prosper, from his mother's father, Prosper Smith. H.P. Corser's mother, Harriet, was Prosper's youngest daughter, and she was gifted. While the other women in the family worked as cleaning women, Harriet was a music teacher by the age of 18, and she shared her love of music with her boys. H.P. was thoughtful, intelligent, and sensitive, and he loved addressing an audience. When he was 21, H.P. graduated from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. His classmates recognized his talent for speech and appointed him as class poet, and he addressed their graduate ceremony in 1885. H.P. was modest in manners and appearance. He was not very tall, but slight, and wore his dark hair short, parted neatly on the side. He bore a generous smile beneath a bushy mustache and prominent hook nose. His thin-rimmed spectacles added to his distinguished qualities. H.P. Corser became a teacher and taught lessons in private schools around New England. After a few years of teaching, he felt something missing. He went back to school to try a new profession, law. After 2 years of law school, H.P. Corser graduated in 1889 and was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar. H.P. Corser was a bona fide lawyer, but incredibly, he returned to teaching in the classroom. His 20s had been spent in classrooms, either as the pupil or as the instructor. In 1894, he heard the calling that would change his life forever, to become a minister. Once again the student, he attended Union Theological Seminary for 2 years, graduating in 1896. Corser was 30, ambitious, smart, and energetic, but he had lived his whole life in the familiar hamlets of New England. The Presbyterian mission gave him a challenge. Months after graduation, the church sent H.P. Corser to Arizona Territory. He passed an examination in front of the Arizona Synod and was granted a license to preach, and assumed the ministry of the church in Flagstaff. A notice from the July 29, 1897 Flagstaff Sun-Democrat newspaper said, "The Sabbath was made for man, will be the text next Sunday morning at the Presbyterian Church. The evening discourse will have for its theme, What Men Think They Have and Have Not. Strangers cordially welcomed. H.P. Corser, Pastor." After only 2 years, Corser returned to Pennsylvania. The Arizona Republic newspaper lamented, "It is with deep regret that the community witnesses Mr. Corser's departure. His labors here have been fruitful of permanent benefit, especially among the young men and boys with whom he has always exerted a strong influence for good. He is an earnest, practical, generous man, and he will be long held in kindly remembrance by the people of Flagstaff." By the end of the century, H.P. Corser was back in Pennsylvania, where he started. He had wandered through life as a teacher, then a lawyer, and now a minister. On the other side of the continent, the Klondike Gold Rush was in full swing. Alaska was bombarded by thousands of fortune seekers looking for a route to the gold fields of the Canadian Klondike. The cover of the book, Stickeen River Route to the Klondike, advertised the Stickeen River as the shortest, safest, quickest, and best route to the rich gold deposits of the Klondike. In actuality, the Stickeen route was one of the most hazardous and deadly, with no guarantee of success. Despite this, thousands came through Fort Wrangell on their way up the Stickeen River. Just before the Klondike Gold Rush, Fort Wrangell was a scrappy white settlement next to a much larger and older Tlingit village. When ex-Marine Van Buskirk visited Fort Wrangell in 1896, he described the scene. "There is only one lodging house in Wrangell. It is a rather dirty, badly equipped place, run in connection with a whiskey saloon by Frederick Lynch. Here I must of necessity put up. I don't think there are more than half a dozen white families in the town, perhaps as many in which the wives are Tlingit, and another half dozen, I take it, in which white men simply live with native women." Van Buskirk also observed that the town had only one church, the Presbyterian Mission. 20 years earlier, the congregation in Fort Wrangell was formed by a Tsimshian Christian man named Philip Clah McKay, who ministered to Fort Wrangell's Alaska Native population. When he fell ill and died, he handed off the reins to Amanda McFarland, who ran a boarding house for Native girls, and Sheldon Jackson, who earned national fame with his stories about his work among Alaska Natives. The Reverend S. Hall Young would follow and publish extensively about his Tlingit congregation. Before the Klondike Gold Rush, the Presbyterian Mission in Fort Wrangell was founded by and made of Alaska Natives. But the Klondike Gold Rush changed everything. For several years, the mission had been under the stewardship of Dr. Clarence Thwing and his wife, Carrie. Thwing was a medical doctor by training, not a clergyman. When the Klondike Gold Rush hit Fort Wrangell, the town's white population exploded. These white newcomers balked at sharing a church with Native people, even though the Native people built the church and worshipped in it for decades. In March 1898, the white members of the church splintered and formed what they called the Second Presbyterian Church. According to a report of the Commissioner of Education, the Native Church has a communicant roll of 85 and a Sabbath school membership of 100. A church composed of white settlers was organized, with 23 members. A year into this schism, the Reverend H.P. Corser was sent to Fort Wrangell to minister to two divided congregations. On June 24, 1899, H.P. Corser boarded a steamship bound for Fort Wrangell. What he found would change his life forever. H.P. Corser was about to meet the Tlingit. Chapter 2. Lamentations. Throughout his life, H.P. Corser was a model of New England refinement and manners. He was studious and articulate. He seldom strayed outside the lines. And yet, when he arrived in Fort Wrangell, something changed. H.P. Corser emerged as something of a nonconformist, stepping up to the challenge and finding himself aligned with the Alaska Native people he came to know. When H.P. Corser arrived in Fort Wrangell, he encountered a community segregated along racial lines, from the Wrangell Historical Society. The town's population during the first decade of the 20th century totaled roughly 800 people, including both natives and non-natives. Many early prominent non-native businessmen had married Indian women. However, the native and non-native communities remained separate. The natives occupied the south end of town, went to a separate school, and had limited opportunities to participate in Wrangell's economic life. H.P. Corser's own flock was divided in two. The First Presbyterian Church, who founded and shepherded Fort Wrangell's Presbyterian mission for a whole generation, and the one-year-old Second Presbyterian Church, comprised of white outsiders who came with the Klondike Gold Rush stampede. Having two congregations stretched the demands on Reverend Corser's time. He delivered 5 services a week for his native congregation and 3 services a week for his white congregation. Sunday schools were segregated as well. The U.S. Army's response to reining in the mayhem of the Klondike Gold Rush was to station a detachment of the 24th Infantry in Fort Wrangell. The 24th Infantry has the distinction of being known in history as the Buffalo Soldiers, African American men, many of them former slaves, who served in the United States Army throughout the American West. H.P. Corser and his native congregation welcomed these African American soldiers with open arms. A visitor from the Synod of Washington wrote, H.P. Corser, who recently took charge of our work, was overjoyed to see us, and we all attended the native church. The choir, consisting of Indians and of the United States regulars from the fort, assisted in the singing, and a group from the native church sang, Jesus, Lover of My Soul, in English and in their own tongue. Mr. Corser extolled the faithfulness of the Indian brethren and their zeal in prayer. The same month, Corser found himself embroiled in a controversy with the newspaper editor of the Douglas Island News. Corser had delivered a sermon supporting belief in both evolution and Christianity. The editor accused Corser of being an infidel and called evolution a complete humbug. The Stickeen River Journal captured Corser's response. Reverend Mr. Corser, on being shown the article, said in his usual good-natured way that he was quite willing to make his position clear. Evolution as applied to physical nature is no longer a theory resting upon the logic of a Darwin or a Spencer, but is an established fact. The evidence is indelibly stamped in the Rock of Ages, from the primary stratum of the Silurian period to the last sod of the Tertiary. It is an open book as plain as Holy Writ. In 1902, when President Teddy Roosevelt single-handedly created the Alexander Archipelago Forest Reserve, H.P. Corser protested. Alaska Native people still owned this land, said Corser. The president had no right to put native lands into a reserve, especially when native people never extinguished their claim, use, or occupancy of the land. Corser feared that Seattle's timber lobby would seize all the timber, while Tlingit and Haida people would not even be able to collect for even so much as firewood. In H.P. Corser's first years in Fort Wrangel, he quickly aligned with the interests of his Tlingit congregation. He was not only a minister, but a trained lawyer with years of education, and he lent his voice to advancing the interests of his Tlingit congregation. Throughout his life, the single most important issue to H.P. Corser was education. And when he began to speak out about the poor quality of education for Tlingit children in Fort Wrangel, H.P. Corser crossed the point of no return. From his first arrival, he lobbied for a teacher at Fort Wrangel. When the secretary of the Board of Home Missions visited, Corser personally got the man to promise to endeavor to secure from Congress next winter a teacher for the native children, 75 to 100, of school age at Wrangell. Corser described his first arrival to Fort Wrangel as, whites and Indians were both suffering. As, for example, at that time, there was not in the town of Wrangell a boy or girl under 16 years of age that knew as much as the multiplication table. The responsibility of education in Fort Wrangel fell somewhere between the U.S. federal government and the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions. The town was not officially incorporated as a city, which meant the town had no way to levy taxes to pay for a school. Corser was fed up waiting for the powers back east to solve the problem of educating the young people in Fort Wrangell. He published his complaints in the local newspaper. He admonished his own superiors in the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions, including Sheldon Jackson. He accused them of raising money without getting results. The board noticed. Corser received a stern letter of reprimand. He was to never again publicly criticize Sheldon Jackson, the Presbyterian Mission, or any of its employees again. Writing about this moment in later years, Corser let loose on Sheldon Jackson. Dr. Jackson lined himself up with those people that had made large investments in Alaska, were exploiting it, and whose ambitions were to get as much out of it as possible and to do as little about the evils that have resulted from absentee landlords. It was charged, and sometimes with great show of truthfulness, that many of the educational reports that were sent to Washington were interesting works of fiction. Jackson's book shows that he absolutely failed to understand Alaska and its people. The topic of self-government was popular among Alaskans, but Sheldon Jackson opposed it, as self-government threatened his power. H.P. Corser, who had hardly made waves in Arizona or Pennsylvania, was now taking up fights in Alaska. He was unhappy with his bosses and letting them know it. He suspected them of being disingenuous, self-serving, and dishonest. He had barely been on the job 3 years. H.P. Corser may have had grand ambitions for his Klondike congregation, one that involved relocating and founding a new community. In an interview with a Presbyterian publication, Corser let slip his great wish. Anxious to remove his Indians from the contaminations of the white people at Wrangell to some island where, shut in by the sheltering arms of the sea, they might carry on industries which would make them self-supporting. This is similar to the story of William Duncan and the founding of Metlakatla. 15 years before, William Duncan was an Anglican missionary in Canada, ministering to a congregation of Tsimshian converts. When he fell into a dispute with his church superiors, he relocated the entire community, people and buildings, from the Canadian interior to Annette Island in coastal southeast Alaska. They founded Metlakatla, a self-sustaining community, and still Alaska's only native reservation. Writing years later, Corser offered glowing praise of Metlakatla. The success of the Metlakatla Indians under William Duncan in the southern end of Alaska has been an inspiration to other Indian towns all through southeastern Alaska. Each Indian community was anxious to have their town as good as was Metlakatla. In communities where Indian towns and white settlements were together, there was always a difficulty. The quiet, modest New England pastor, H.P. Corser, was ruffling feathers and had grand ambitions. By criticizing his own superiors in the church, he risked being stranded, jobless, in this remote Alaskan outpost. The Presbyterian Board sent H.P. Corser to quell the chaos caused by the Klondike Gold Rush. Instead, H.P. Corser vigorously stirred the pot, charting his own course, one that would lead down the path of Exodus. Chapter 3. Exodus. It's 1979. Alice Rooney, a young Episcopal Church volunteer from California, sits down for a chat with one of her church's elders, a man named Bill Taylor. Bill is very old at this time, with a high-pitched, wheezing voice and a persistent cough. Still, he regales this wide-eyed missionary with stories about his youth. Bill was born in 1895. He remembers Fort Wrangel, the Klondike Gold Rush, the Star of Bengal, the Great Fire of 1906. And Bill was there the day H.P. Corser led a rebellion of the First Presbyterian Church. Alice Rooney tape-recorded these conversations with Bill's permission. The audio is badly degraded and not easy to hear. Here is the transcript of Bill Taylor's eyewitness account of Reverend Corser's rebellion. He was having trouble with the big shots, the heads of the Presbyterian Church. They, too, were against mixing with the Indians, and Wrangell was full of Indians at that time. So there was the heads of the Presbyterian Church came here, and they saw that, and they told Corser it had to be done, or he had to be removed as minister. So after those people left, he had a big meeting, and he said he would have to be relieved of his responsibility as minister, or else start a church of his own. Now, he said, I have an appointment coming up. If I want it from the Episcopalian Church, they said we could start a church of our own. I wonder how many people in this congregation would follow me. All those that would, I wish you'd stand up." The whole church just bounced up just like a balloon. All of them Indian people were on the right side. My mother was Indian, my dad was a white man, and we were on the left side, and we all jumped up just like that. Nothing to it. So when that was over, Mr. Corser stood up there by the pulpit, and he couldn't talk. He just kind of mumbled, tears coming down his face like that. Took his handkerchief finally, and rubbed his face up just by himself, sobbed good and heavy and got it out. After that, why, he said, "All right now we have to find out a place where we can start a foundation to build a church on, and we have to raise some money, somehow, some way to do it with." H.P. Corser's Klondike congregation set him free. They took a chance on each other, one that would pay off. Together, they would forge a Christian identity, infused with Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and indigenous sensibilities. The church adopted the name the People's Church. Its location touched the Tlingit village to the south, a physical symbol of its alignment with the native community. If Corser was waiting for the right time to leave the Presbyterian Church, he found it. 1903 was also the year that Fort Wrangell adopted self-government and became the City of Wrangell. It could levy taxes and support a school. Corser's rebellion was not the end for the Presbyterian mission in Fort Wrangell, far from it. The rift was painful, but the mission had deep roots. The Presbyterian Board of Home Missions called home one of its most prolific, accomplished, and respected missionaries. She was a powerhouse, hard-working, and whip-smart. She was also half Tlingit and from Fort Wrangell. They called in Tilly Paul Tamaree. She knew Fort Wrangell, having grown up there, leading the younger children in activities, and translating the minister's sermons into Tlingit. She quickly earned respect for her high intelligence and missionary zeal. She was away from Fort Wrangell on another mission when she got the word about Corser's rebellion. She did not want to return, but she relented. She was successful at restoring some, but not all, of the native congregants to the Presbyterian mission. In September 1905, the Douglas Island News reported that the People's Church at Wrangell has gone over, body and breeches, to the Episcopalians. 2 years later, H.P. Corser was ordained an Episcopal priest by Bishop Peter Trimble Rowe. The schism in Fort Wrangell did not begin with H.P. Corser. It began before he arrived, under Dr. Clarence Thwing. Corser, like his congregation, came to a breaking point. The city of Wrangell, newly incorporated, now had 2 churches with deep roots in Wrangell's Alaska Native community. Wrangell was growing up. Chapter 4. Acts. H.P. Corser described his congregation like this: "The people are hard-headed and very practical, and expected much from their minister." H.P. Corser spent the rest of his life based out of Wrangell, occasionally ministering in Juneau, Ketchikan, and the newly established community of Norwegian immigrants called Petersburg. He continued to speak out on the economic interests of his Tlingit congregation. He spoke out against the fisheries syndicate, was in favor of Alaskan self-government, and helped to sell Liberty bonds during World War I. His civic record was long. He served on the board of the Red Cross, was active in the Chamber of Commerce and the Igloo of Pioneers, served on the school board, and he ran the Boy Scouts. His heart was in education. He became principal of the Wrangell schools in 1903. The church built a gymnasium, along with a reading room, and offered the first education to native boys in Wrangell beyond 8th grade. Corser's St. Philip's was also very active in the earliest days of the Alaska Native Brotherhood. H.P. Corser was a bookish man. He was well-educated, well-read, and meticulous. It may have come as no surprise when he came asking his Tlingit parishioners to share their clan stories for a book. Corser loved stories. He had tried his hand at writing plays. He gave lantern shows, which were early versions of the slide projector, using a flickering lantern to project images onto a wall while he spoke. Throughout his life, he was in front of an audience, whether teaching, ministering, or storytelling. Corser's congregation was full of stories, epic stories, as big as anything told by the Greeks or the Romans, all set in the wilderness of southeast Alaska. In these stories, people met face to face with spirit worlds and animals capable of speech and transformation. The stories boiled down to tales of life, death, honor, and family. These stories lived in spoken word, an oral tradition going back centuries. But the modern world threatened this tradition and the very survival of these stories. There was no doubt the world was interested in these stories too. Tourism was already an active trade in Wrangell and other Alaskan destinations. Tourists snatched up trinkets sold by Klondike traders in Wrangell. In Seattle, a totem pole stolen from Tongass village drew big crowds. Sacred artifacts and clan symbols had already disappeared into the hands of collectors. In Alaska Native tradition, clan stories are owned as much as clan symbols, land, waterways, and physical property. H.P. Corser was also a relative newcomer to Alaska, hoping to take something uniquely Native American and share it with the world. And yet, H.P. Corser was no raider. He was close to these people. Before Corser, there were ministers in Alaska who tried to forbid the telling of clan stories. Those were the old ways, they said. Leave them behind. Corser embraced the stories. He saw the lessons, and he knew other people would appreciate it too. In 1910, H.P. Corser published the book that would change his life. From Juneau's Daily Record Miner. Next week, the story of the totem, a legendary folklore history of the native totem pole, will be printed from this office. The interesting manuscript is by Reverend H.P. Corser of Wrangell, and the edition will consist of 10,000 copies. The book was a modest success. In future editions, Corser renamed his book to Totem Lore of the Alaska Indian and the Land of the Totem. He became known as something of an expert on Alaska Native culture. When tourists came to Wrangell, he often greeted them at the church, then gave them a tour of the totem poles and their meaning. For several years, he worked as an interpreter aboard a ship bringing tourists up to Alaska. By sharing the stories, Corser hoped to bridge a gap. Said Corser, "I quickly saw that before you can do much with the people, you must learn to understand them first. How do they look at things? This led me to get as familiar as I could with their legends and their theory of life." His mother and father lived into old age, and he often visited them in Pennsylvania in the fall. He made the month-long trek from Alaska down to Washington, then east to Pennsylvania. His visits generated newspaper publicity for his sermons and his lantern shows. When H.P. Corser was the guest speaker, he tailored his lantern shows to the interests of the audience. One trip to Pennsylvania, he entertained a group of scouts on the subject of Indians, Boy Scouts, hunters, and big game in Alaska, and to a church group on the good work being done by missionaries and ministers of the gospel. He could tailor his talk to any audience using the same slides. The Tlingit people H.P. Corser met changed his life. They gave his life direction, meaning, and a purpose. He made his life's work among these people, presenting their side to the world. Chapter 5. Revelation. In October 1930, during a windy, snowy blizzard, a fire raged inside the Presbyterian Church in Wrangell. It was the same old wooden building Reverend Corser first arrived at, and the same building he walked out of some 30 years before. The whole town turned out to put out the roaring blaze. At the age of 60, Reverend Corser rushed to help put out the fire. If he had any hard feelings about the past, he didn't let them get in his way. Tragically, the building was a total loss, and Corser was seriously injured in attempting to save the building. The Fairbanks Daily News-Miner reported. The Reverend H.P. Corser, pastor of the Episcopal Church at Wrangell, was so seriously hurt in helping to fight the blaze that he will be incapacitated for some time. He fell, suffering painful bodily injuries. In a portrait photo taken in the later years of his life, his frame is noticeably heavier, and his shiny, swollen hands suggest he had edema. 2 years after his injury, he paid what would be his final visit to his family in Pennsylvania. Despite his noticeable infirmity, he delivered the New Year's sermon at St. Mark's Episcopal Church and a free public lecture on Indian lore of Alaska. Wherever he traveled, he talked about the people who had changed his life. His identity was connected directly to the Tlingit. 1 year before he died, a chance encounter on a vessel traveling through Alaska would demonstrate the identity H.P. Corser created for himself. From the Pomona Progress Bulletin in 1935. "What does the word totem mean?" we asked a clerk who was trying to sell us one made of finest quality ivory and magnificently carved. "I haven't an idea in the world," she replied blankly, and then, seeing a distinguished-looking elderly man nearby, she nodded toward him and added, "I believe he can tell you." The man thus pointed out was none other than the Reverend H.P. Corser, author of Totem Lore and the Land of the Totem. For 35 years he has labored in this land, his beloved land. Looked up to by the Indians and sought for his counsel and help, he has naturally gained their confidence. Many of them have told him their legends. These he put into his books. The article then quoted Corser directly. He said, "Everything, wind, trees, mountains, rivers, birds, fish, had its special spirit. It was considered a great honor if anybody came in contact with one of these spirits. A family that had no contact with a spirit was considered very poor indeed. Totems served as memorials, as coats of arms, and for a great variety of purposes." On Sunday, February 3rd, 1936, H.P. Corser died of a stroke in Wrangell, Alaska. He was 72 years old. He never married and had no children. In 1987, the Wrangell Historical Society petitioned the National Park Service to include St. Philip's Episcopal Church on the National Register of Historic Places. In the nomination form, the Society wrote, "Harry P. Corser influenced the social history of Wrangell when he boldly defied convention by supporting the rights of natives to worship with the non-native community. His defiance of convention and open admiration of native culture influenced the non-native community." Wrangell History Unlocked is written and produced by Ronan Rooney. Music from today's episode was performed by Mary Rooney.